We've taken a look at the business operations of westward settlement. And now it's time to take a look at settlement itself. What compelled people to just pull up shop and settle on the plains? The biggest law that assisted in these efforts is what we've come to refer to as the Homestead Act. Now, Republicans had wanted a homesteader law for some time, but Southerners always opposed it on the basis that it would discourage slavery. The Civil War gave Republicans their opening because Southerners were not seated in Congress, and they passed the Homestead Act in 1862. It was to take effect on January 1st, 1863, which is the same date that the Emancipation Proclamation was to take effect. Any citizen could file an application for a 160-acre plot of land, and within 5 years it would be theirs, so long as they improved the land. Within 1 year of acquiring said land, they could even transfer the title for a price of $1.25 per acre, and many took advantage of the law and erected very shoddy structures that passed as houses, so they could either rent out the land or perhaps start a business. Now, the total number of farms in the U.S. tripled from 1862 to 1910, but most went broke because 160 acres really wasn't a sufficient amount of land to sustain life on the plains. So small farming gave way to large agribusiness, like we've seen with the bonanza farms, but again, even big bonanza farms didn't always work out. One thing we see is that thousands upon thousands of settlers are willing to engage in truly back-breaking labor because they can earn freedom. The prospect of true freedom is enticing to them. Going along with this Homestead Act would be what's referred to as the Exoduser movement, and it describes the mass departure of thousands of black Southerners for the plains of Kansas in an effort to take advantage of this act. Now, the main reasons for this migration were that many freedmen realized that political participation in the South would never be a reality. So they're fed up politically, and economically speaking, sharecropping was an untenable way of life. When this exodus occurred in the late 1870s, it made white Southerners realize that their economy was dependent on the labor of now free African Americans, so they wanted to stop it. But as early as 1871, agents were sent to Kansas to determine how hospitable it would be for settlement. And former slave and now free carpenter Benjamin Pap Singleton took it upon himself to promote the opportunities of the West, including this sign that you see on the screen, which is courtesy of Pap Singleton. Frederick Douglass voiced disapproval of the movement because he felt that fleeing the South would only postpone the inevitable struggle for civil rights, though there were few that shared this perspective, and the great Frederick Douglass was even publicly booed for this opinion. Many simply wanted to enjoy the rights they had earned following the Civil War and revel in the prospect of property ownership, which drew so many west. About 30 to 50,000 black Americans left the South for lands in the West at this time. Although the rich soil they were used to tilling was vastly different than that of the plains, but nevertheless, many of them will begin to prosper through their back-breaking labor. Now, it doesn't matter who's heading out to the plains. Survival is a horse of a different color. Lack of water is a big problem. But in 1874, Daniel Halliday invented a windmill that could pump water from up to 30 feet underground. Now, these windmills needed constant maintenance, and the prairie fans, as you see on the screen, were not improved upon until the 1880s. We already saw the steel plow, courtesy of Illinois blacksmith John Deere, but the steel plow, the sod buster, will be critical to life in the plains because the steel tip will more easily cut through land that's been dormant for centuries. Now, you have lack of water. You have land that's tough to cultivate. The other issue is lack of wood. Where do we live? How do we mark boundaries? The housing issue was somewhat solved by constructing sod houses like you see on screen. and the very tough prairie grasses could be used for construction purposes. The sod would be cut into triangles and piled atop one another, but they did require continual maintenance and they were subject to rain damage. These sod houses were mainly for areas that the railroad didn't run through. If the railroad runs through, then sod houses were quickly replaced with wood frame or stone houses, which were construction materials that the railroad could provide. When it came to marking off the land, barbed wire was patented in the mid-1870s by Joseph Glidden, and production was at 80 million pounds per year by the 1880s. Large cattle barons used this barbed wire fencing to fence in land that was in the public domain to try and claim it for themselves. Charles Goodnight himself ran 250 miles of it across the Texas Panhandle in 1884. And again, there's little wood on the plains, so barbed wire was sold in abundance to mark the property lines. And cattle don't necessarily like to go through it, so the fencing in of this land and the use of barbed wire is ultimately referred to as the invention that closed the frontier, because the long drives could no longer go through these lands. And on the prospect of ending the West, informally, you could view the end of this concept of the West in April of 1889, specifically at noon on April 22nd, 1889, when the federal government advertised a one-day land rush that would provide prospective owners with lands that they could claim. And you could either hop on a train that spanned the length of Oklahoma, because Oklahoma is where this land rush is taking place, or you could ride your horse, travel in a covered wagon to the site. Thousands lined up at the border, many of them hailing from Kansas and Missouri, and they awaited the signal that the rush was on. Now the quickest horsemen, the quickest of these settlers, soon discovered that some of the best plots of land were miraculously claimed by another covered wagon or another settler who got an illegal head start. These people were nicknamed Sooners, which is why Oklahoma is the Sooner State. Now, the mere fact that the federal government was now giving away land that was once viewed to be untouchable, so far west, this distant Indian territory that natives would never be bothered, the fact that it's now giving it away tells us that the West is beginning to fade into oblivion. And in 1893, Wisconsin historian Frederick Jackson Turner made the claim that the American frontier had come to an end. Now his thesis, his claim, was that the American experience was marked by different frontiers that were ever-changing and evolving. As one group made their way west, the people who were the first in the area were alarmed at what appeared to be the advance of civilization. And he noted that the 1890 census proved that the population density in the West made the term frontier unreliable, as there was no longer any marker to separate settled areas from unsettled ones. He made the comparison between the American experience and the Greeks. Just as the Mediterranean was critical to the Greeks, this shifting frontier has been critical to the United States, and the finer points of his thesis were and have continued to be debated. But the idea is clear. The Wild West was gone, and growing settlements were cropping up in their place. Nobody illustrated this better than Frederick Remington in his 1895 painting, The Fall of the Cowboy. And it really shows how this way of life is closing. Originally, this painting had a train in the background. But Remington wanted the focus to be on the sky and the fence, the cowboys. The dull and drab colors suggest that Remington himself fully understood that this way of life that he had romanticized in so many paintings really was coming to an end, and a transition was about to occur.